Thank you so much. I honestly have to say this is the warmest welcome to an event I've had. Y'all are making it really hard for the future cities I go to. So it is such a pleasure to be here with all of you very early in the morning. I don't typically speak this early in the morning, but a huge thank you to the Baptist team, to Commissioner Clay Bibbs, to the cityCURRENT team for bringing me here. It has been an incredible experience since I got here on Wednesday. I'm kind of sad to be hopping on a plane to go back to Atlanta, but I feel like I'll be back in Memphis at some point soon. So I'm just really grateful for all of you joining us this morning to talk about mental health. And we've already heard that there is no health. There is not a lot of other things if we are not actually focusing on our mental health. And we talked about this a little bit last night. I think for a long time, the conversation about mental health has only focused on mental illness, but there's a whole host of other things that we can be focused on when we're thinking about our mental health. So thinking about things like sleep hygiene, thinking about saying no, even if it is to Commissioner Clay Bibbs, thinking about the boundaries that we need to set with difficult people in our lives. And so I hope that we can have an incredible conversation about some of those things and many others this morning. Thank you.
So here's where it gets fun. We're going to throw up a number on the screen. So we'll have you can take whichever seat you want. Technically, we slated this one, but take that one. Take that one. So here's the fun. We have the number up on the screen, there you go, that will come to my cell phone, and I will curate the conversation. No pressure, but last night there were a ton of really amazing questions. And it was heartwarming, but also heartbreaking to see what people were dealing with. And so it became a little bit of a therapy session. Now, give them the disclaimer that starts every podcast.
Yes, I am a therapist, but not your therapist. And this is not licensed mental health advice.
We're fans of our podcast. All right, so start, though, before we dive in heavy, though, start with a little bit of what led you to launch the podcast, because it originally started as a blog, but I want them to understand your heart for this space. So give them just a little bit of why you started the podcast and kind of your focus going in.
So I know I have some AUC alum in the building, some Morehouse men, and any other AUC grads? Just the Morehouse guys. Okay. So I was actually the director of the counseling center at Clark Atlanta University before Therapy for Black Girls was my full-time job. And if anybody knows Atlanta, you know you don't get anywhere quickly. So I had a 45-minute commute each way to Clark Atlanta, and I fell in love listening to podcasts. So I would listen to all these conversations, and I thought, wow, this would be a really great way to share mental health information as well. My husband actually has a background in radio production, so I had an in-house producer. I did not have to outsource that. So I was like, oh, let me try this. And then the podcast just took off. Like before we even could do a lot of publicity, people were sharing it in their group chats and with their aunties and cousins. And it really has not stopped since then.
So the big why in terms of bringing Dr. Joy to Memphis, we were talking about it last night, is Memphis has one of the largest under 18 populations in America. That can be a huge opportunity, but it can also be a challenge. And when you look at the pandemic and what happened when kids were not allowed to go to school, their after-school activities were cut out, all of a sudden, all of their positive social interactions, their positive role models, they lost. And we're really just now here locally, but nationally, feeling the repercussions of this. And when you look at us better understanding what our youth are going through, the trauma and the challenges, that's a big part of today's conversation. So I want to pivot and start out with, how do you frame, because you mentioned obviously the conversations prior were focused on mental illness, and now we're really talking about mental health. And you're starting to see with the pandemic, the conversation around mental health becoming a lot more open. But where do you see us right now overall? Like, how do you kind of say, hey, here's where we are with mental health? How do you describe the state that we're in right now? We'll start with broad, and then we'll go into more individually, like with youth. But where do you place right now mental health?
Honestly, Jeremy, so this is a big question, but I think we're at a crisis point, honestly. I think a lot of the outbursts that we see, so people kind of having incidents on airplanes or in airports or in grocery stores, the road rage kind of experiences, I think a lot of that is actually a holdover from the pandemic. I think a lot of us held a lot. People were incredibly anxious. We lost a lot of things. And so when we think about grief, I think we only tend to think about the loss of life. But grief is also the loss of experiences, the loss of things we had planned to do in 2020 to 2023. And so I think a lot of people are really contending with this idea that a lot has been lost. And I don't think, well, we know we don't typically do well as a society talking about grief. And so after, we kind of returned to work, there was no slowing down. There was no real focus on, wow, what is this thing we've all been through? And I think a lot of people are still really dealing with that. And I think our mental health is really not in a good place right now.
You had a guest on your podcast, and you were talking about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And now, like when you look at the pandemic as one that we all went through, but how do you now carry that over? How do you describe the mental health for our youth? What does that state look like?
Yeah, I don't think that that's great either, honestly. We know young people don't always have language to describe what they're feeling, but it doesn't mean that they don't have feelings, right? Like have very big feelings. And so sometimes we see it in behavioral outbursts or we see it in conduct kinds of things. And so I think we have to be really honest with our kids about how they're feeling, but that means we have to be in touch with how we are feeling first, right? To be able to open up some of those conversations. And so I think it's really important to make sure we're checking in with the young people in our lives and creating avenues where they feel comfortable telling us, hey, I don't feel so great about this today. I've been very encouraged to see parents and other caregivers talk about mental health days with their kids, right? And so it isn't important to have perfect attendance if it means pushing them past their limits, right? And so really starting at a young age of teaching how to advocate for yourself and how to really say, I'm not okay, I feel like I need some extra support today.
Where do you place the mental health for young Black boys and girls?
So that's incredibly concerning. And so I think many of my colleagues in the mental health profession will talk about like the rising rates of suicide that we are seeing in young Black children, which is terribly concerning. And I think for a long time there was this myth in the field that Black people don't die by suicide, right? Like that's not something that we do. And I think a lot was missed because we were not properly paying attention. And so I think a lot of young people are struggling. Like you mentioned, the pandemic really caused a lot of isolation, a lot of loneliness that we are just now trying to figure out. I think we've been hearing reports from teachers about like the learning gap and like how much was missed during that time. And so I do think we do need to kind of take a step back and slow down and say like, hey, let's actually pay attention to all that was lost in this past couple of years before we just jump back into curriculum. I think there needs to be a slowing down.
What are some ways for those in the audience and obviously everybody online, when you look at as adults, being involved with the nonprofits, supporting the space, what are some ways that we can be intentional to support the mental health for youth? Not biologically our kids, but for youth in the community. And then we'll talk about biological kids as a parent, but what are some ways that we can be intentional with our efforts?
I think that that's huge, right? Like I think we are each other's responsibility. That's what it means to be a part of a community. And so even if you are not biologically connected to children, it's still important for you to show up. And I think consistency is one of the biggest things with kids, right? And so if you say you're going to volunteer for a program, you do need to show up because they will begin to miss you and wonder like, oh, why haven't I seen so-and-so? And so I think being consistent is incredibly important for kids' mental health. I think doing what we say we will do and being reliable, being a speaker, being an adult in their life that they can go to with difficult concerns, positive affirmations and like speaking life into them, I think is really important. And you don't have to be biologically connected to be able to do that. And so I think really approaching kids with, wow, let's look at all the things we can do as opposed to focusing on all the things that have gone wrong or the deficits is really a much better way to approach their mental health.
For all of you who've seen Bill Courtney, he talks a lot about, obviously a Memphian, being the turkey person, right? And so if you get a chance to see his presentation, the Oscar award-winning film, documentary, Undefeated, he was the coach, but he talks about he was trying to win the trust of his players, and the players looked at him and said, we're just trying to figure out if you're a turkey person. he's like, what? Yeah, you show up on Thanksgiving, you give us a turkey, we never see you again. So being consistent to win the heart and trust, to earn the right to be a positive influence in their life. Extremely, extremely important. And I think that's something we really try to fight against, is not just giving the dollars and saying it's your challenge, it's your problem, go solve it. It's, hey, here's the dollars, and oh, by the way, I'm going to be intentional, I'm going to show up, because that's what matters. They have to see you and build that relationship. We're seeing a lot of questions come in, so good job, everyone. Man, they're flooding fast. All right, I want to touch on a couple from last night. One is you talked about, as a parent, though, social media. Obviously, very important for our kids. Give us a couple of ways that you monitor and are mindful for your media, but also for your kids.
So this is a big one. This is actually one of my favorite topics to talk about, because I probably spend more time on my phone than I honestly supposed to anyway, which a lot of us do, I think, right? Because it feels kind of mindless, but I think that mindlessness is what actually leads to being difficult, because you want to be mindful in anything that you're approaching. And so the mindless scrolling can be really difficult. I think especially given the political climate, we know there's so much tragedy happening in the world, it is really, really easy to get activated online. And so you look up and you realize, I've been on here for 3 hours. Like, where did that time go? And so I think setting limits for yourself. So there are all these apps that you can like flag, and it will like kick you out of an app after a certain time. Or there's a really good one called Focus that like doesn't even allow you to go to certain websites at a certain time. So if you really need some extreme help, that could be a good one. I also think being very mindful of like what kinds of pages you're following. I think a lot of us like kind of see ourselves as like one huge DIY project, like a self-improvement project that never ends. But a lot of times when we're following like aspirational pages, it actually makes us feel worse about who we are. And so I'd encourage you to do audits every now and then of your social media pages to see, are you following people that make you feel better about yourself? Or are you following pages and accounts that actually make you feel pretty bad? I think when we think about like the mental health and the impact related to kids, so there's lots of research that talks about like not even allowing kids to have access to social media before 16, because they can't, again, process all the things that are happening. And again, thinking about like some of these accounts that they're following, are they thinking they need to look a certain way to be accepted? And we know there's a lot of bullying, unfortunately, that happens on social media. And so really trying to keep that away from them for as long as you possibly can, though I know that's really hard. But if they are on there, they should be monitored. So I think there are a lot of things that like Facebook and Instagram especially are doing, where like a child's account has to be connected to like a parent's account. And so making sure that you do have access, that you are kind of overseeing what's happening, who they're talking to, having conversations with them about not really trusting strangers online. Because as we talked about last night, I think it feels very easy to get familiar with people and you think you know them, but you don't actually really know these people online. And that's hard, I think, for kids to understand. So making sure that you're having conversations with them about how to keep themselves safe online.
We'll stay on the social media theme. So this is a question coming in. You can put in there if you want me to call you out or not. Some of them, said anonymous. Do you believe social media has increased this mental health crisis? What are your thoughts around social media usage, which kind of ties in? But do you believe that social media has increased the mental health crisis?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So there's a lot of good that happens with social media, right? Like a lot of mental health professionals are on social media, and so it's easier to find therapists in your area to connect with and to get resources from. And so I think it is good in that it has made mental health information much more accessible and like being a great resource for people. The downside, though, is I think that there are some incredibly triggering videos and things that we see, and it's like we're always on now, right? Like there had always been awful things happening in the world, but we see them so much more frequently now. And our human psyche is not actually meant to be able to withstand the level of tragedy and like violence that we're seeing online. And so you can actually experience something called vicarious trauma by watching certain videos and seeing different kinds of clips. And so it's really, really important to pay attention to, like the videos that will pop up. So I encourage you to turn off autoplay on your social media app so that you don't accidentally scroll into something that is very activating for you, and to put some distance there, right? Like I think a lot of times when bad things happen, we want to be a witness to other people's pain, and so it feels really important to watch, but you can also be a witness without actually activating yourself. And so I think it's really important to set some limits and boundaries around what we intake on social media.
And the Vicarious Aces, too, is one of the themes from one of the other podcasts. Touch on, you mentioned this last night, which I thought was really interesting, is the proliferation with social media of everybody being an expert, but you said, you have to be very careful of who you seek advice from. And so talk about kind of that aspect, is that there are specialists, obviously, in your field, so when you talk about sharing a challenge, being specific about who you go to.
Yeah, I think it is important. And I think because social media kind of gives everybody a platform, if people like talk well and like they look like they know what they're talking about, sometimes we can be fooled into believing that they actually do know what they're talking about. And they don't always. And so I think it's really important to make sure you're vetting your sources. So even if people have a license online, I think it's important to go to the state's website to see, do they actually have a license to practice? Is this somebody who is actually skilled and has expertise to be able to offer the information that they're saying? I also think it's really important because, especially as it relates to mental health, like so much about what I would say to a particular client really depends on me really knowing that client. And so there's no way I can talk to all 500,000 people who are following us on social media in a way that's actually accurate because I don't know all of those people. And so I think it's important to be very careful of anybody who seems like to have all the answers for everybody, because it's impossible to do that on social media. And so be mindful that you're not kind of following blind into these situations where people are kind of proclaiming to have all the answers without actually having a relationship with you.
What role does self-esteem have in mental health?
Oh, it's critical. It's critical. I mean, self-esteem is like the ideas about who you are to yourself. Like, what kind of messaging are you giving to yourself about who you are, how worthy you are? And I think if that is difficult, if you have like a fractured relationship, so to speak, with yourself, then it makes it really difficult to feel good about yourself, which then makes it difficult to form relationships. It makes it difficult for you to show up in workspaces. And so I think that that really is the cornerstone of our mental health in a lot of ways.
For those of us in the room who are educators, what role do institutions, whether K through 12 or post-secondary, play in supporting mental health, and how can they better prepare students for their eventual transition to the workforce?
So when you think about the number of hours that you spend at school and in workplaces, like that's a lot of time. Like you're typically in the school more than you're at home. And so you think about the difficulty and the toxicity, I think, sometimes that exists in institutions like schools. And it makes it like the kids don't want to be there because the parents are not happy, principals not happy, teachers are not happy. And so it's not going to be a place that is affirming to a kid's mental health. And so I think being able to give students a voice as much as possible. Now, we know kids would make different decisions than we would as adults, right? They want to have pancakes for breakfast every day. But giving them a voice, I think, into the school and like how things are running, I think is really important. And discipline is important, but it is also important not to be brutal in the way that we are disciplining kids and really making sure we're talking to them about why certain things are happening. But I think when you think about the hours that you spend at school, it is important for there to be like a system-wide understanding that we want to create spaces where people are excited to be and that we're actually taking care of the kids who are entrusted to us.
I want to kind of transition that because, so obviously for those who have kids, the last few days have been brutal for them with all the lockdowns, right? Like the social media scares. And what was interesting is I texted our son and said, "Hey, you okay? What's going on? Have they and he's like, "They haven't really told us anything. Like we're just kind of following this too." When schools are going through these challenges, and obviously, you're dealing with it in real time, but what are some ways that they can communicate to help the students understand, to process these very real things that they're facing head on that, we as parents might not even be equipped to really step into?
Yeah, so I think it can't be business as usual the day after there has been a lockdown. So I'm not actually sure what the protocol is, but I feel like there needs to be like some opening assembly the morning after something like that happens, maybe with a school counselor to talk about, hey, this is what happened, and give people an opportunity to share what they're feeling. Sesame Street has done an incredible job of creating resources that talk with kids, that allow the parents to talk with kids about some of these very scary things. And I think this is something a lot of us even don't have language for because it wasn't necessarily a thing like when we were in school, right? And so I think being able to look to places like Sesame to get some answers so that you can talk with the kids in your life, I think is really important. But I do feel like it starts with acknowledging like, hey, this was a scary thing that happened. Like, let's talk about it and make it okay for the kids to share that they were scared or afraid or, concerned. I think that's important.
So we talked about some deep conversations last night. This kind of falls in this category. I'm dealing with significant grief. I've been to therapy several times, but don't seem to click with the therapist. How do I or we overcome that? How do we find a good fit with a therapist?
Yeah, we did talk about this a little bit last night. So the therapeutic relationship is probably different. Well, I know it is different than your relationship with other medical professionals in your life, because even if like your dentist doesn't have the greatest bedside manner, if they're a great dentist, you might hang it out, right? But with your therapist, if you don't feel like it's clicking, it's going to be really hard for you to actually get the help that you need. And so it's not a bad thing to say, I don't think that this is a good fit for me anymore, and to maybe ask the therapist, do you have recommendations for another therapist that is XYZ? Because if you kind of know what you're looking for, it's okay to tell the therapist to see if they have referrals that they would suggest. And we know that we are not the best fit for everybody, and so you're not hurting our feelings. I think that's a lot of what comes up is that people don't want to hurt the therapist's feelings and feel like they will be hurtful. But we understand, and so we want you to get the help that you need, and that may mean working with someone else.
Talk about how you practice mindfulness yourself, because you also have professional help. So, I mean, you yourself live exactly what you preach, right? So talk about how you yourself practice mindfulness.
So I tell people every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, I am in my therapist's virtual office because a lot has been going on, right? And so it's important for me to also have a place where I'm talking about how I'm feeling. I also try to do a really good job of kind of wrapping up the workday before I transition into the rest of my life. So I have 2 young sons, and so they're very busy, and so it's important to kind of have a buffer because I found when I didn't, I was like very irritable. And so if I don't give myself enough time to kind of transition from like work life to mom life, it makes it difficult. So having that transition time is really important. I also am very close with a lot of my friends still in the Atlanta area. And so having places where I can kind of not be Dr. Joy and just kind of hang out, I think is really, really important.
Touch on setting boundaries. This was an important theme last night, and it was setting boundaries professionally, personally, with family, with friends. Touch on how you personally set your boundaries.
Yeah, so boundary setting is one of those conversations I think we see a lot, but we don't always know what that looks like in practice. And so something I shared last night was to think about whose name pops up on the phone and your immediate reaction is, oh, right? Y'all already have somebody in mind, don't you? So that is likely a person that you need some boundaries to be set with, right? And so one of the red flags, I think one of the key signs that you need some boundary setting is feeling resentful, because that means that you have probably stretched yourself too far for too long. And so thinking about what kinds of things can I say no to more? And again, I think we think about boundary setting as a bad thing because it feels mean or abrasive, but you can set boundaries with love, right? Like you can say, oh, I'd really love to be able to do this thing tonight, but I can't, right? Like that isn't a hard or awful boundary. It is just, but it is a boundary. And I think it doesn't stop with setting the boundary. It is enforcing the boundary that is often the hard part, right? And so the enforcing part, I think, is when we really let people know, like, I'm not okay to do this, or it's not okay to talk to me in that way. So for me personally, my boundary setting has really been around not having so many people have access to me. So Cyrena, my assistant, is here. And so, there's no shortage of people who like want something or like want consultation or want something. But if everybody was emailing me directly, it would be very difficult for me to kind of do what I needed to do. And so having an incredible team has been really helpful for me to set some boundaries in my life.
How do we shift the culture in this country, especially in the Black community, about mental health and wellness? How do we shift from vulnerability is a weakness to vulnerability is human and addressing it is strength?
I think we're doing it right now, right? Like, I think having all of us here to have these conversations is really important, but I think it doesn't stop here, right? Like, I think you have to then go back and talk with the people in your personal circles about the kinds of things we talked about here today, or to share resources, share episodes of the podcast, share different kinds of things so that you are sparking the conversation. And it may not mean that people are immediately ready to go to therapy, right? Like, it typically takes people a very long time from a conversation about something to actually acting on it, but you don't know what seeds you're planting. And so just being able to share resources or share insights about the kinds of things that you took away from here can go a very long way.
I know that's something she mentioned last night, was using the podcast as a catalyst to start a conversation. So if you don't know how to have a difficult conversation, you can say, hey, listen to this episode, or it becomes a prompt, right? And so this also carries over into the workplace. We were talking last night about how do you, as leaders, open up the safe spaces, open up the opportunity for mental health to be more front and center, and it starts with leadership and being more vulnerable, right? And I think for, especially for those who are looked up to from the youth, the athletes, the actors, the people in prominent roles, them being open on social media, in the media, and being vulnerable is kind of that role modeling impact. Touch on, though, for the corporate side of this, share a couple of ways that we can be more active in opening up those opportunities for our employees to feel like that sharing their mental health is a safe opportunity.
So I think it first has to start, Jeremy, with you as the leader not being the reason why people need mental health support in the first place.
Touche.
Right? Because I think a lot of times, I don't think, well, maybe they know and they just don't care, but a lot of times people in leadership make their team's lives miserable, right? And so you can't say like, oh, I'm all about mental health if you are the reason why people need mental health support in the first place. Ooh, am I calling people out? I don't know. But I think that is where it starts, is actually making sure that you are creating a healthy environment for the people who are actually in your office. Also making sure they have access to the resources. So I love the fact that Concern is a resource for the Baptist team, but also anybody who wants to contract with them, right? And so giving your team like, hey, I know that mental health is important. We have started this contract with Concern for you to have 8 sessions to take care of whatever it is that you need. I also think it's really, really important, if a team member comes to you with a concern about their mental health, that it is confidential. So it should not be on the agenda at the next team meeting. It shouldn't be like office gossip. Like, if people trust you with something that is very private, it's important for you to keep it private and maybe try to connect them to additional resources.
There was a lot around parents with struggling youth last night. And there was one in particular, and this kind of plays into some of the questions that we're getting asked, is, for parents, very sadly and tragically, who have kids who are dealing with suicidal ideation, who are dealing with massive depression. What are some tips for parents to have those difficult conversations, to be more intentional? What can they do to better support their kids, their own kids?
So I think it starts with knowing what resources are available in the community, like what therapists have openings, what kinds of crisis response teams are available. I also think it's really important that we not be afraid to say the word suicide, because again, a long time there has been a myth that if you ask somebody if they're suicidal, it makes them suicidal, when actually that is not the truth. So actually asking people, are you thinking about taking your life? Do you have thoughts of hurting yourself? Makes it so that it feels okay to actually talk about that thing. So I think we have to get comfortable asking some difficult conversations and being ready for the answer, right? It may not always be the answer that we expect. I think when you are a parent who has children who are struggling with their mental health, it's important for you to have your own support system. So there are lots of support groups, both in person and virtually, for parents to come together to talk about their concerns, because you don't want to project any of your fears or your anxieties about what's going on with your child onto the child. And so having your own network of people to talk about those things with, I think, is really important.
This is an interesting twist. What are the traits of mentally healthy individuals?
So that feels like it exists on a spectrum. And so what health looks like for me is not necessarily what health looks like for you. But I think what we typically see when people like start therapy or, feel really good about themselves is that they are making decisions that they're really proud of. I think mental health also looks like having relationships that are very fulfilling, that are reciprocal, where you feel like you are seen and you are seeing other people. I think it also means doing work that you're proud of and that you feel like there is a purpose for your life and that you're kind of contributing in some way that's healthy. I think it means paying attention to like your physical activity and like what you're consuming. Are you active in different places in your life? I think just fully kind of engaged is what mental health looks like to me.
One of the things, going back to the parents, and we do a lot with parents to engage the youth in volunteer opportunities, because when they start serving others and realizing that their life has meaning and they're making a difference in the life of somebody else, it's immensely fulfilling. And the power of volunteerism to transform your life as the volunteer is something that many overlook. And I think it's a segue, but really only about 25% of America volunteers. And so when you look at that, 75% of our community is disconnected. Well, 75% also means that's an opportunity to get them involved, and especially for our youth, imagine if they're serving each other and serving others, what that does to put them on the positive spectrum for seeing their life as an opportunity to have this higher purpose and create meaningful change. Any tips for grieving broken sibling relationships?
Ooh, that's a tough one. So I think with grief of any kind, it's important to give yourself time to grieve. I think a lot of times we want to put a clock on grief. Like, okay, this happened 2 years ago, so I should have moved past it. There is no actual timeline or a clock for grief. And so allowing yourself to feel whatever you feel for as long as you need to is really important. I think also finding support from people who don't make you feel bad about whatever has happened in the sibling relationship. Because sometimes, if it's broken because you decided that this person is not like a good influence for you and they actually detrimentally harm your mental health and you decided to take a step away, sometimes there can be family who force you to say, oh, that's your brother, you should talk to them, right? But if that's not actually in your best interest, then you need people who will affirm that decision for you. And so I think finding a support system that actually is okay with affirming your choices is also important.
Stresses of job search. So talk about, for those who are dealing with stress of a job search, creating a support network. Sometimes family and friends don't get it, or how to help.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, I think, just kind of given the economy, a lot of people are searching for work right now. And I think it's important to remember that work is important, but it's not actually who you are. I think, again, because we spend so many hours at the workplace, our identity gets wrapped up in work. And while work is important, it's not all of who you are. And so making sure that you are putting time and energy into developing other parts of your life, I think is important. But also looking at what kinds of things that you maybe have been interested in that you didn't have time to do because you were working a 9 to 5, right? Like, are there volunteer opportunities that you want to engage in, or some other hobby or interest that you didn't have time to cultivate? And looking at ways that you can make money from some of those things without it being necessarily a 9 to 5 is important.
What things have you seen in other cities that give you encouragement for the way they are supporting mental health?
Ooh, so I don't know what city. I feel like it's maybe Portland or somewhere like West Coast-ish. They have actual mental health professionals who are like the first responders in a mental health situation, right? Like, we've seen so many of these sadly escalate because the people who respond to mental health crisis are not actually mental health professionals. And so I feel like there are some cities who are doing a really good job of like sending therapists out to de-escalate a mental health situation as opposed to maybe law enforcement.
We'll do a few more. We're getting tons of them. So since it's Suicide Awareness Month, how do you feel about the current suicide prevention measures that we are currently taking in the field?
So I think that we are doing a good job, but of course there's always room for improvement, right? I think that it has been encouraging to see more culturally specific rationales and like prevention programs for different kinds of communities, because we know what works for one community is not necessarily the thing that will work for everybody. And so I think it's important to really have culturally specific programs. So I'm very encouraged to see so much of that. I also think that the field has done a good job of like being more open open to talking about suicide and getting away from like some of the older practices. So the mental health professionals will know that we used to do these suicide contracts with clients that like we would make them sign something that says like, I will not hurt myself. Well, that is not super effective, right? And kind of enforces this, very weird dynamic. And so I'm really excited to see that we are kind of thinking through things more compassionately and in ways where we are actually supporting clients more as opposed to just trying to keep ourselves out of trouble. Because I think for a lot of us, it just becomes like, oh my gosh, this is a liability concern. Like, how can I actually help? And I think we are actually moving in a way that's much more compassionate.
We're getting a few questions, so I'm going to kind of bundle them together, but it's around the mental health crisis for single-parent households. I want you to touch on it from both what the mental health trauma is for the youth, but also for the mother and the family and what that looks like as well. So talk about the mental health challenge that we're seeing in terms of the single-parent households.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that comes down to time and resources, right? So if there's only one person who's kind of primarily responsible for a young person and you're at work and then having to do other things, like, is there still enough time and energy to really devote to, being the kind of parent that you want? And I think that a lot of parents then feel guilty about not being able to step in that way. And then the kid feels like, oh, do I really have people? And so I think one of the things that is really important is thinking about the family that you can create for yourself, right? Like there's the family we're born into, but there's also chosen family. There's a family we can create. And so I think looking at the community, looking at the village, and who else can help in rearing the child, right? So you may be the person who gave birth to the child or who assumes responsibility, but you don't have to be the only adult in that child's life. And so this is where grandmothers and aunties and play cousins and all of those things can kind of come into play with really helping to raise a child so that it doesn't feel like it is only one person's responsibility.
We'll do a few more of these. Tips for reassuring a young teenage girl what they see on social media from influencers to dressing a certain way and thinking that society really is and not loving self or being comfortable in their own mind and body. So basically talking about how do you deal with reassuring a young daughter and dealing with body shaming.
That's a hard one. And I don't feel like I have a good answer because I feel like this is a conversation many of us are having in that it doesn't feel like there's a whole lot for that like teen tween stage, right? Like it feels like we had like Disney Channel programming and like other kinds of things when we were younger. And it feels like largely that has disappeared. And so what kids are turning to is like social media influencers, right? It like that kind of feels like their entertainment. And so I think keeping them active in other ways as much as possible. So whether that is sports or Girl Scouts or other kinds of things so that they have other outlets to connect with real girls in real life, I think is really important so that their entire identity is not shaped through virtual means, I think could be a way at that.
Talk about, the question is, does church replace therapy? Or can they coexist? But because what was interesting is, even last night, holistic, more clinical, like talking about the balance and the collaboration among all the entities, but tying in church. So talk about the church and the role that it plays in therapy.
So Dr. Keith and I had a great conversation about this morning, and it sounds like he is preaching a good word on Sunday about...
His other question on this is, where do men go when the women they work with won't allow them to attend dinner with the speaker that his budget pays for?
So this was Dr. Keith's
That
question.
can be a sidebar. But the question at hand is, does church replace therapy or can they coexist?
Yes. So they absolutely can coexist, and I think ideally they should, right? Like in the most ideal sense, this is where your community thrives, is if there is a strong relationship between faith and the mental health practitioners. And so I've been very encouraged to hear congregations like Dr. Keith and others around the world and the country that talk about mental health from the pulpit, right? Because if the preacher gets up and says like, hey, here are these resources and let's talk about suicide, like, can you imagine the doors that opens and like makes it so that, oh, I don't have to feel embarrassed about feeling these kinds of things. And he said that it was okay. And so now I can actually take the opportunity to go and talk with somebody about it. Some churches even have a mental health ministry. So there are like counselors on staff that the congregation can go to. And so I think it is absolutely incredible that they do coexist. Again, I think that is one of those myths that talked about if you struggle with mental health, that means that you don't have a strong relationship with God or your faith walk is weak or something like that. But that's not true. Like, we know that they can coexist and they should.
This is a good one, and then we'll start wrapping up. How do you get over feeling guilty for your past mistakes?
You know, guilt is a feeling just like any other, right? And so I think we get into trouble when we try to squash it down and like brush past it, as opposed to just sitting with it and seeing what it's trying to tell us, right? So it is a feeling, and it typically is a messenger just like any others. And so I think when we get curious about where the guilt comes from, we don't feel like we need to kind of brush it away. But I also think it's important to remember that we are not like robots. We all make mistakes, right? Like, none of us here are perfect. And so there are definitely things all of us have done that we regret, or we feel like we made a horrible mistake, but you're not defined by the worst thing that has happened to you. You still have plenty of opportunities to redeem yourself and plenty of new good decisions to make. And so I think focusing on, okay, here's where I messed up, but it doesn't mean that I'm done, right? Like, that I can't redeem myself.
You can wake up and say, today's going to be a great day. As a tennis player, they say you lose way more of your matches than you win. And like, the average tennis pro only wins like 52% of his points. So it's like you're always losing. You have to deal with that mental aspect. So this goes back to the conversation we were having about the pandemic and how the kids, unfortunately, the youth, were pulled in a negative direction. And the question is around the kids getting into gangs and how do we get them out? So how do we pull someone from I'm over here because there's acceptance and love and an identity? How do you pull someone who's gone that direction, who's immersed in it now? How do we pull them out as a community and pull them into a positive direction?
So you bring up a great point, because I think a lot of times what is initiated by that activity is a sense of belonging, right? And so that is in a lot of ways a chosen family for people. And so you can't replace something without giving them something else. Like, you can't pull something away without giving them something else. And so what kinds of institutions, what kinds of organizations are we creating for our young people where they have a much more viable option with people who love them and affirm them? Because again, kids don't always understand, like, any attention is good attention if you've not had any, right? And so if we think about different ways to give our kids attention, give them different ways to kind of get involved in things with people who care about them, I think that is a pathway to that.
As we wrap up, we'll give it a two-part question. The first is, give us a couple of things that we can put into place today, very soon, to be more protective of our energy personally. So this is the personal side. What are some things that we can do with boundaries, with energy, to help put our lives in a positive direction personally? What are a couple of tips?
So we had an incredible skill tip this morning. I feel like she already gave us one. And so thinking about physical activity and like really getting your body moving every day is really important. And again, it doesn't have to be like a CrossFit, like super rigorous kind of thing. Like a 15-minute walk really is good enough to just kind of get the endorphins moving, give you some clarity. So I think physical activity is really, really important. I also think gratitude journaling is a missed practice for a lot of us. And so gratitude journaling does not have to be this formal, pull out your notebook, get very serious, but just opening the notes app on your phone and like jotting down 2 or 3 things that you're grateful for every day. And that can be a really good way to kind of just shift your perspective so that you're not always focused on the awful things that are happening. I think that's important. Also cultivating moments of stillness. So I think so many of us are running from meeting to meeting, event to event, that we are not slowing down, actually checking in with ourselves. And those moments are really important. So either first thing in the morning, like she talked about, or in the evening before you kind of go to bed, just giving yourself 10 to 15 minutes to check in about how you're feeling and what's coming up for you.
Sounds good. The Skillway business tip, perfectly rolled right in. So professionally, couple of tips professionally for us to be able to be better leaders, be more mindful leaders.
Leave work at work. I think that is a huge boundary. Look, somebody's clapping like, oh yes, I'm ready to log out now. I think that that is a huge boundary that has gotten very messy with the advent of like cell phones, right? Like you used to be able to leave work at work, but now there's the expectation that you're always on because like your work email is on your phone. Take your work email off your phone if you can, and leave work at work. I think it is important to create a boundary because then work does not become your life. It becomes only one part of your life. And so I think having a boundary there is really important. And I think, again, making mental health something that is okay to be talked about in your workspace so that people know that it's okay not to be okay and that there are resources available and not being the reason why people need mental health support.
So my words of encouragement is get involved, volunteer. There's so many amazing nonprofits, organizations where you can work with our youth directly. But last thing is wrap up, words of encouragement to get involved in the community and the ripple effect it can have for our city.
Yeah, so that is an incredible way. You know, the Surgeon General has talked about this epidemic of loneliness that he feels like many of us are experiencing, and getting involved in volunteering is an incredible way to do that. And to remember that we are each other's responsibility. And so being able to check in on a neighbor or volunteering at your local school or doing different kinds of things in the community means that you are showing up. And the idea is that you show up for other people, so then other people show up for you. And that is how we all feel like we have a part in it. I think so many times we get overburdened because we're trying to take everything on for ourselves, but if we actually allow people to step in for us, it makes that whole life much easier.
Give it up, Dr. Joy Harden Bradford.